Oh, excellent. Great. So, good afternoon and evening and also morning to everyone. First, of course, I need to extend my appreciation for the hosts of the webinar, and it's really been an interesting series, and the Wellbound Uni is super happy to take part of this one and contribute, and also to engage in discussions with the great set of speakers today. So, if we swiftly move over to next page. I will talk a little bit about the perspective on inclusive and accessible public space from a disability perspective. And first, we need to remember that it's estimated that today, around 15% of the global population have some experience of a disability. And also recall that disability is a result of societal barriers to persons with different functionalities. The majority of persons with disabilities today live in a low income context, and that disability just needs to be seen from both as a cause and a consequence of poverty. We can also mention that, as we all know, urbanization is rapidly increasing. And by 2050, around 1 billion persons with disabilities will reside in cities. The number is around 50% today. Meanwhile, this increase of urban residents with disabilities, the aging population is also rapidly increasing. And this puts a pressure on cities to really adapt their strategies and practices so that spaces and services will be usable by all. And next page, please. So going back to the core references when it comes to in our understanding, at least, disability inclusion and accessibility from a global framework approach. Our core reference is, as always, in our work around disability rights, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which do not only have accessibility as cross-cutting, but also in specific articles. The 2030 agenda is very clear on disability inclusion, and many of the SDGs will not be reached without guaranteeing and ensuring universal accessibility to service spaces, products, etc. And it also has a sort of universal accessibility approach in many of the goals, not least SDG 11. Then not to mention also the Sendai framework, which puts emphasis on universal design to be incorporated for long-term resilience. And of course, on urban development, the new urban agenda, which is also specifically highlighting the needs and rights of persons with disabilities, accessibility, and universal design. And all of these frameworks are and instruments are mutually reinforcing, while as the convention in the UN is the only legally binding, the others are political commitments. Next page, please. So when it comes to legal aspects and standards, when it comes to universal accessibility generally from a disability rights perspective, as I mentioned, accessibility is cross-cutting in the UN Convention, and accessibility includes features that increase use of access and breaking barriers to the physical, social, and digital spaces. Because often when we talk about accessibility, a very common mistake is that then only the physical aspects, such as installing a ramp, will solve all the accessibility shortcomings in your public space. And the convention comes with legal obligations for states, parties, that products and services and spaces which are provided to the public are accessible. When it comes to standard and legislation to universal accessibility, and specifically as defined in the UNCRPD, international accessibility standards exist for the usability of the built environment and accessibility, but also within certain countries' anti-discrimination legislations and local standards. Next page, please. So the imperatives, I was reviewing this yesterday, and the imperatives for universal accessibility from our approach would be that building a universally accessible public space certainly benefits everyone throughout their life course, not only persons with disabilities or temporary mobility limitations. and that public space, which actually is usable by all, is the true medium for social inclusive cities. And that the public spaces which works for all provides the space to break cycles of stigmatization and negative attitudes often facing, for instance, persons with disabilities, and enables interaction and participation of diverse groups, not only as active participants, but also in shaping our surrounding communities. And that it creates safety, for example, for youth to shape their social identities when they are young, and for women who face mutually reinforcing discrimination. But we need to remember that public space, in our opinion, is a critical link when it comes to the mobility chain in everyday life. And therefore, we always view accessibility from throughout the day. For example, you leave your house, you go into public space, you go to work. How is that chain creating a barrier-free environment, and what obstacles exist? And lastly, it improves resilience, safety, for example, for evacuation, but also access to information on equal grounds as others. Next page, please. So in order to address many of the shortcomings of inaccessible public spaces today, we feel that it's necessary that planners and practitioners and designers really make efforts to adopt the universal design approach, because this recognizes that there is a wide spectrum of human abilities, as everyone passes through childhood, periods of temporary illness, injury, and some at least 50% and more of pregnancy and old age. And by designing for human diversity, spaces and things are created that are accessible and usable by everyone. And this will not need any adaptations or specialized design in the same extent. Next slide, please. So by designing right from the start is something we have worked on in our policy development oriented work. And by considering accessibility and universal design from the start of any project, lessen the risk of retrofitting. Because as we noted from the second slide, populations which is today seen as specialized solutions will not be economically feasible in the long term as these populations increase and the needs as much. But by taking this already from the start into consideration, it has to be viewed from a perspective of, okay, we maybe did not make the best investment, so we had to retrofit and rebuild later on. But this is terribly unsmart, in my opinion, because retrofitting environments will increase the total costs by up to 20% of a project budget. And if universal design accessibility were addressed at the outset of this project in the design phase, it will only be around 1% to 3% more expensive. But retrofitting and also add-on features later on to a space can also lead to disruption, the general usability and appeal, and also exclude certain groups, because that will be ad hoc solutions, which maybe is usable to some, but not to others. And also by retrofitting, it will demand quite a lot of resources of the city management. And it will also cause and potentially cause negative environmental footprints, not analyzed from the start. Next slide, please. So some challenges, and I know the time is short today, but as we view it, inaccessible public spaces hinders persons with disabilities to enjoy the public spaces and break the cycle of stigmatization and exclusion if we are not able to use that space and interact with our fellow residents. And accessibility cannot really be addressed if you don't have analyzed the availability of the public space, especially since we see that public spaces are shrinking, and also that there is increased competition between public and private interest in the public spaces, and also the presence of contradictory legal policies to uphold different human rights. There is a challenge in that there is an insufficient integration of your universal design in planning and practices. But as I mentioned before, only addressing some specific accessibility component, for example, for a person with physical accessibility, can increase the challenges faced by others. For example, myself, who are partially sighted. And the challenge is also that general assumptions exist that planners and designers per default understand and address universal accessibility, and that complying just with standards will not really trigger change, and that there is a lack of participatory planning and processes with persons with disabilities and other groups in the localities. And lastly, that when we view the public space and the universal access of public space from a global perspective, it's recognized very clearly in SDG 11, but when you go into the indicators, the accessibility component is not measured, and it can result in it can actually divert the discourse on how universal accessibility is seen. Next page, please. So very, very, very quickly on our programming on the side of the World Blind Union, we started with a more comprehensive programming around urban development in 2019. And in January, we entered a milestone agreement with UN Habitat to really support UN Habitat to advance on disability inclusion, universal design, and accessibility in normative and practical work. We work around knowledge production, for example, an ongoing project with an organizational accessibility guide for any types of organization, because we know that working with inclusion and accessibility, it starts with organizational practices, because otherwise we'll not be able to deliver inclusive impact. Policy development is one part of our work, being part of the global conversations trickled down to local levels and to mobilize persons with disabilities and their representative organizations at different levels. Engaging in relevant global networks towards cities for all, comprised of many different types of stakeholders and actors needed to move forward. And last but not least, also a result of where we are and why I am here today, is that we, during WOOF 11, announced a collaboration with CitySpace Architecture to co-create a special edition of the Journal on Public Space on universal design public spaces ahead of WOOF 11 in 2022. Yeah, I see that the year there is wrong. Sorry for that. Next page, please. Yep, so I'd like to thank you all for listening in. I'm looking forward for the other presentations and discussions. And just 3 very quick points to remember: that integrating accessibility universal design at outset is smart, cost-effective, more environmentally friendly, and promotes well-being. And addressing accessibility barriers in all their different forms benefits everyone through their life course. And that fully accessible and inclusive spaces cannot be achieved without the active engagement of persons with disabilities and other diverse groups in planning and design. So thank you very much.